Hi, Dr. Hagmeyer here. In one of my last videos, I talked about the connection between Hashimoto's, autoimmune thyroid disease, and PCOS. And if you haven't watched that video, I'd encourage you to go back and watch that video as well. But in today's video, I want to share with you some information about the connection between adrenal fatigue and PCOS. You know, one of the most common symptoms that I hear about from women with PCOS is obviously the fatigue, right? The question is where is the fatigue coming from? We always have to keep that in mind whenever we're trying to uncover the root cause of an issue. Where is the problem rooted? Where's it coming from? Or what are the connections? So PCOS is no different. With this fatigue, the question about where this fatigue comes from becomes a central point. And that means, is the fatigue coming from the thyroid gland? Is it coming from the blood sugar and insulin resistance component? Or is it coming from another piece of the puzzle, which again is the adrenal glands? Now, in many cases, women with PCOS often have a hidden cause of adrenal fatigue. And this is an area that is very important, and it's worth testing if you care about your health and if you care about getting to the root cause of why you're not well. How do I know this? Well, for starters, over the years, I've probably tested hundreds of women with PCOS, and I've seen just an alarming connection that exists between the thyroid, the adrenals, and the ovaries. But perhaps you're watching this video and you've never heard of the adrenal glands, or you've never heard of these glands called the adrenals. And if that's the case, it's okay. I'm going to explain all of that to you and more, so much more, in today's video. So how might a woman with PCOS expect to feel if there is an underlying connection with the adrenal glands? Well, for starters, the questions that I would pose to you is, one, do you feel exhausted even after a good night's sleep? Okay. Do you notice that your energy levels kind of taps out, or you notice a great deal of fatigue at 11 a.m., 1 p.m., or 4 p.m.? Okay, those are some very, very critical times within that time zone, within an hour or two. Do you feel stressed out with the little things in life? Do you depend on coffee, soda, or some other kind of pick-me-up or drink to give you a kickstart? Are you putting more weight around the belly, around the midsection, in the arms, okay, in the love handles, okay? Do you experience dizziness when you stand up too quickly? Do you have salt cravings or sugar cravings? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you toss and turn throughout the night? Now, if you said yes to say like 3 or 4 of these symptoms, your PCOS will never improve until you start looking at the connection between the adrenal glands and the ovarian connection. Okay, why is this? Well, here's why. Your adrenal glands are called your stress hormones for a good reason. Okay, they produce several different hormones like cortisol and DHEA and aldosterone, and each of these hormones, if not in the normal physiological levels, can be responsible for any of these symptoms that we just mentioned. Okay, like I said earlier, the link between stress and PCOS is incredibly strong. Okay, but what exactly is stress? How does stress affect our lives? How does it exacerbate PCOS? Okay, answering this question could be the difference of years and years of suffering or years of joy. Okay, the thing I think that's so important is when we talk about this connection between the adrenal glands and your PCOS, one of the key components, of course, is how do I begin to feel good again? And if you can establish that connection, there's no reason why you can't get better. Okay, let me say this, a couple things about stress that I think we often forget. Okay, when most people think of stress, we think about emotional stress, right? We think about the kind of stress that's brought on by our job, our family, our husband, our finances, you know, arguing with teenage kids. But this is only one kind of stress. Okay, stress can be a physical stress or even chemical stress. And so here's what I mean by that. Chemical stressors include things where our bodies encounter, say, toxins. Maybe it's toxins from the environment. Maybe it's toxins in the cosmetics that you wear. Maybe it's the toxins that are released by bacterial infections. Maybe it's toxins in the workplace. Do you work in a perfume counter, or behind a perfume counter rather? Do you work in a salon where you're coming in contact with lots of different kinds of chemicals, right? Do you have food sensitivities, right? Do you drink alcohol? Do you consume excessive amounts of sugar? Okay, these are just a few examples, but I think it's important to be aware of them, right? Here's the thing to remember. It doesn't matter what kind of stress you're undergoing. Stress is stress. Any kind of stress, whether it's a perceived stress or a non-perceived stress, will cause a release of cortisol. And that cortisol, again, is one of those hormones that's released by the adrenal glands. Now, if this is just one area, okay? In other words, this is just one problem. The problem really lies, I think, in uncovering where this chronic stress comes from, but also, in addition, is the key here is chronic stress, okay? Anybody can deal with acute stress, right? Under conditions of chronic stress, however, we have fluctuations in our blood sugar, or we may have a chronic elevation in glucose, which is, again, our blood sugar levels. This is one of our tie-ins to PCOS, right? One variation of PCOS is this insulin resistance component, okay? So what's insulin resistance? Well, this is where the glucose that we consume from our diet can't get into the cells to make energy, okay? I want you to think of it like this. Whenever we have too much glucose or sugar, okay, in the blood, your pancreas is going to release insulin. Now, it's the job of insulin to take this glucose, grab this glucose, if you will, and get it into the blood cell or shuttle it into the cells where now your cells and your mitochondria can begin to make energy, okay? But what if your cells don't respond to insulin? Well, then we have all this excess sugar. Instead of being converted for energy, it's going to be stored as fat, what we call glycogen. And whatever we don't use for glycogen now is going to, of course, get stored as triglycerides. So if you look at your blood work, maybe you have elevated levels of triglycerides. And what this all means is that you are not using that energy, right? And so as a consequence of not being able to use that energy, the brain is one of the first areas to suffer the consequences of that. And so you find yourself having and experiencing brain fog. You have trouble focusing and remembering things. Learning new tasks becomes difficult, and you become run down, okay? So remember this, chronic stress causes chronically elevated cortisol, and chronically elevated cortisol leads to increased insulin, and increased insulin takes its toll on testosterone levels. And this has obviously been demonstrated in several studies, and this is also why we see women with PCOS have elevated levels of testosterone in all different kinds of irregularities in their menstrual cycle. So again, there's our connection between chronic stress and insulin resistance. And just as a summary, here's a quick visual to help illustrate this important point. So what do we know about PCOS and insulin resistance? Well, insulin resistance is common in women with PCOS, and it is one of the main reasons why a particular drug called metformin is typically prescribed. But the question is does this metformin really correct the root cause of the insulin resistance and the high cortisol? And the answer to this is not by a long shot, right? We know that many women can't tolerate metformin in the first place. For many women, they begin to experience all kinds of gastrointestinal pain and bloating and nausea and vomiting. Maybe they experience muscle pain. Maybe they have increased fatigue. They have lactic acidosis. They begin to experience diarrhea. And the list goes on and on and on. So what else do we know? What else do we know about insulin? How about weight gain, right? We know that insulin is a fat-storing hormone, much like estrogen is. If you have too much insulin or too much estrogen, you're going to put on that weight in those areas that we just talked about. Again, the more insulin you make, the more weight you gain. In this illustration, we can see many of the problems that are associated with insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. We see that insulin can increase our cholesterol, it can increase blood pressure, it can increase our triglycerides, which we just talked about earlier. It can cause all sorts of problems that are associated with metabolic syndrome. And again, this is all very, very common in women with PCOS, and it's why 3 p.m. or 4 p.m., you're feeling tired and you're feeling grumpy and you're feeling foggy-headed and you're experiencing sugar cravings and caffeine cravings, okay? Now, sometimes a woman with PCOS also has something called non-classical adrenal hyperplasia, or NCAH, okay? Sometimes a woman is diagnosed with PCOS and doesn't have PCOS, but she does have non-classic adrenal hyperplasia, okay? These are very, very similar symptoms, okay? Then sometimes a woman has an autoimmune thyroid disorder called Hashimoto's disease, okay? The reason I bring all of this up is that it's easy to be misdiagnosed. And without the proper testing, you don't know if you're dealing with one of these, all of these, or a combination of these. And again, that I think is really the critical part to managing these kinds of cases properly, okay? So just to wrap this videos up, there's a couple of things I just want you to remember. Number one is if you or someone you know is suffering with PCOS, no matter how lousy you feel and hopeless you are, don't give up, okay? There's always a reason. And if you can find that reason, there's no possible explanation in terms of why you can't get better, okay? Number two, if you have these symptoms, you want to get your adrenal glands tested. Now, I personally prefer testing this through saliva, but you can also test this through blood. And if that's something that you need help with, just reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to help you get the tests that you need. Because again, these are not typically tests that your traditional endocrinologist or your typical general practitioner is familiar with or willing to run. Number three, we talked about chronic stress causing elevated cortisol levels, and we talked about chronically elevated cortisol levels leads to insulin resistance and weight gain and increased testosterone and even a further deterioration of the symptomatology associated with PCOS. Okay, so there you go. If you like today's video, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure that you give it a thumbs up. Make sure that you check out some of the other videos that we've done. And if there's some information that you want to see as it relates to PCOS and the adrenal glands, or really any kind of problem associated with the hormonal system, leave a comment below, and we'll do our best to shoot a video on that if we get enough requests. Okay? So take care. Until next time.